Hello, Nintendo!
Hello, and welcome to episode 39 of Hello Nintendo, where we turn everything into the Fire Temple because we are bringing the hot takes on the Legend of Zelda series. That's right, we are finally getting to our round 2 of Zelda discussion. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. Today, I, the Scottish Lion, aka Alec, will be joined by Michael, aka Awada Fan. How are you today?
Doing well, glad to be here.
And also special guest, Alexand. You may know him from the Our Nintendo Discord. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for asking. How are you doing?
Good. Alright, so you have not been on the podcast before, and while our Discord family might know you a little bit, what's something that you'd like to share about yourself? What do you want to share about yourself?
Well, for starters, welcome everybody. My formal name is Daniel. Nice to meet you. There's not much to say about me. I enjoy Discord a lot. And before that, before Discord ever existed or was relevant for us, I also used Reddit a lot. I use Reddit and I go as Portal Dark, if you ever saw me on the our Nintendo server. I mean Discord. Pretty much that. I love games, especially Nintendo. I also play other platforms as well. Basically, anything that it's good. It doesn't matter which platform, I'm gonna play it.
What is your favorite video game?
I have a very fun memory. Kirby's Adventure for the NES was my first game ever. For that reason, Kirby has a special place in my heart. And my favorite video game right now, basically because of that, is Kirby's Adventure. Even if it is so dated at this point, even if they remake it as Nightmare in Dreamland, I still enjoy the NES version more.
So speaking of playing video games, we always do our What Are You Playing segment, and let's start with you, Daniel.
RuneScape, old school RuneScape, because I got hooked up again. I used to play it like 2 years ago. Got hooked up again. I'm really enjoying it. It's a decent game. It's not by any means perfect because they have issues like any other game, and that's fine. But in the Nintendo part, I recently got two games, specifically Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Undertale. I already beat Undertale, so I'm focusing more on Xenoblade Chronicles 2.
I have been playing a little bit of Banjo-Kazooie. Actually, I haven't been playing that much, but I beat Another World, and I'm still going to save talking at length about Banjo until a little bit later in this podcast history. Michael, what have you been playing?
I have been playing, honestly, since the Nintendo Switch Online service came out. I've been playing the NES games a lot, actually. I haven't had a lot of time this last 2 weeks, so that has been filling up most of it. But I also went out on a limb and bought a type of game that I've never played much outside of multiplayer settings with friends, and that is Tom Clancy's The Division on the PlayStation 4. Now, I do play this in multiplayer settings. I've always engaged in the game in that way, but I've never done the single player campaign much. So I decided to go out on a limb and try this new game out, a type of game I would never otherwise buy. And I actually love it. It's been really fun. I'm surprised how much I enjoy it because historically I've been more into action adventure type games, and whether guns are involved or not is not important to me, but I actually really enjoy it. So I'm glad I took a risk to try something new because I spent maybe all of Monday evening going through a good portion of the game because I was so engrossed in it.
I've never played The Division, but I used to play Destiny in year one. I don't even remember what year that was. That's similar, right?
It is similar. It's I think there's a few more tactical elements to The Division where you're doing a lot of hiding behind objects and like kind of strategizing about how you go about it. And of course, that's a thing in Destiny as well. It's just the main difference is the setting. You're in a post-apocalyptic New York in The Division. And with Destiny, of course, you're in space and fighting off an enemy race, I think. I didn't play the original Destiny, but I'm assuming it's about the same as Destiny 2, which is fighting back against an enemy race of aliens, I think, who have taken over your planet and decimated your populations and armies, and you have to fight for the return of your planet to yourself. I think it's something to that effect. Honestly, I'm not even an expert on that because I've only played that in multiplayer, and we never watch cutscenes when we're playing multiplayer for some reason. So all I know is the gameplay is about this pretty similar for sure.
Now, last question would be, how much time does the Division take up? Do you have to put a lot of time into it at one point? Because that's why I just stopped playing games online, because I don't have time to spend an hour or two doing a raid.
Yeah, well, I mean, the single player campaign is something like, I think you could do each, I believe they call them missions in this game. You could do each mission in sometime like 10 to 30 minutes. So that's the time commitment there. And then it's just automatically saving at all times. And there are even checkpoints. So if you just pause when you've done a portion of a mission, you can also come back later. As for the online matches, those also vary. Those can be anywhere from something like 10, 15 minutes to an hour. It just depends on what mode you're playing.
Well, thank you for, as always, bringing us something unique to the Nintendo podcast. A little bit different than an indie game, but hey, I like it. Thanks for the review. Moving forward. Daniel, I want to start off with you because on our part 1 of our Zelda podcast, I believe 2 episodes ago now, we kind of talked about where we started with The Legend of Zelda. Now, you said that Kirby Adventure was your first game, so was The Legend of Zelda on the NES also a game you played?
Not really. My first Zelda was, aside from the cartoon that was broadcasted back then, it was on Ocarina of Time. Some time ago, we were kids and we didn't have the chance to buy our own games like we all do now. So if you can go to back 25 years back in time, you can see we can only afford from 3 to 5 games at tops. And that's one of the things. I grew up with Kirby, but I also had Mario, I had Duck Hunt, but The Legend of Zelda was a little bit too complicated for me. And I think I didn't get hooked up to Zelda back then until Ocarina of Time came. That game, I have very fond memories of it. I even though I consider Majora's Mask to be superior on many parts, I still prefer Ocarina of Time over Majora's Mask.
Now that we kind of have the where you have been with Zelda, let's jump into our community questions. We have 4 really good ones that people asked us throughout the past 2 weeks. And the first one, I hope one of you has a response for, because I never played Triforce Heroes. Daniel or Michael, did you play Triforce Heroes?
Yes, I did.
No, I didn't. I skipped that game.
Oh, well, so, I mean, I can tell you about my experience. The question, did I go through the entirety of Triforce Heroes with 2 other people? Or did I do it with random people I don't know, or perhaps even single player, which is an option for what it's worth. It's not multiplayer only. And the answer is I did not. I went most of the way, though, and it's to the point where I was at the final boss battle. And that's when I lost my 3rd person, which was needed to complete this portion of the game. And actually, after the boss battle, there's a whole new array of additional levels that you can go through that they added as download content later. But I did not finish the story of the game, and it got into this weird pattern where we were waiting to see if this person would be able to finish it with us. And then too many months passed by to the point where we actually lost all our ability to play competently to begin with, we started wondering if we shouldn't start over or something, but life got in the way, and so we never finished. And so at this point, if I'm going to finish, I think I have to actually play single player, which is a totally different experience because you're controlling all three links in the game and helping each of them pass through the game. And that's just a lot easier and less tedious with two other real players. So it is one of those games that's ideally played multiplayer. It can be done single player. One of these days I will finish it. It's just been on hold for a very long time now, maybe 4 years, I think.
The AI characters, when you're doing single player, how would you rate them on a scale from the alien AI from the game Alien Isolation to a Call of Duty random campaign?
Oh man, well I think the AI in these games is in Triforce Heroes is conservative, so it will do it to an extent, I think, but not it won't go all the way for you, and that's why you switch control of players. And honestly, I can't even remember if there's any AI elements at all. It could be that they do wander around with you automatically, but at the very least, if you have to perform a very specific task with items, you do have to take manual control of the other links in order to do that. So I would say the AI, if it is there, and I can't remember because, like I said, it's been too long since I played, it's limited to just walking around with you and maybe jumping up places. It's certainly something where you have to manually intervene to help things along.
Moving on to our second question. In that same topic, would you want the next 2D Zelda game to be a single-player adventure, or do you want another multiplayer opportunity like the Four Swords or Triforce Heroes? Daniel, let's start with your response to this question.
This is an interesting question because, well, it's been like, what, since A Link Between Worlds, since we got a top-down sort of experience that was not to call Triforce Heroes bad, but normal to another Zelda games, different from Triforce Heroes. I think I would like it to be multiplayer if it was handled like Four Swords did. If it is not handled like Four Swords, because Triforce Heroes was nothing like Four Swords, I would like a more single player focus adventure. Basically, because that's the immersion you get from Zelda.
I agree. So I don't even want to consider a multiplayer Zelda game. I've never played Zelda to be a multiplayer game. And if it's just going to be a mediocre multiplayer prompted up by a Zelda skin, I'd rather them focus on developing a single player game. Michael, what's your response? And then I have a tangent question to this.
Sure. I love Zelda games, 2D Zeldas, especially because those are among the first games I played. Link's Awakening DX, if you know me at all, is my favorite game. And so the more of that I can get, the better. And at this stage in history, I'm actually afraid Nintendo may just not make 2D Zeldas anymore, which would be disappointing because though there are a lot of indie games that are you would call Zelda clones, they're not as big, and that's the main problem. Most of them seem to have something like 3 dungeons, and that's less than half the size of what real 2D Zeldas were. So I would want to see single player Zeldas. I would do want Nintendo to keep making them. I don't know if we're still in that realm of possibility anymore. And as for a multiplayer Zelda, it could be done in a supplementary way. So, for instance, Four Swords was a supplement to Link to the Past port to the Game Boy Advance. And Four Swords Adventures was kind of a grander version of that on the GameCube. And then Triforce Heroes was a supplementary game of sorts to A Link Between Worlds. It can be done. I think that the engine that they use to build it needs to be used on a single player adventure first before they go off and make a multiplayer. So I welcome it, but only in the context of a preceding, or I suppose it could come soon after as well, single player adventure.
And the tangent question off of this, if we do get another 2D Zelda adventure, so we have A Link Between Worlds, we have A Link to the Past, and while they're different because they were developed in different eras, obviously, I think what would you want, because we're so close to the era between SNES and the 3DS changed radically. We're still on the 3DS era, and the technology has not improved, where we're going to have to, basically what I'm saying is we're going to have to see a little bit of an edit in the game formula to see a quote unquote improvement in the game. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yes, yes, it does.
So what would you change, or what would you add a wrinkle into the game formula to make it a dynamic, diverse 2D Zelda experience compared to the two previous games we've had?
Well, I think the best idea is probably to just make use of unique effects in the game. So a lot of what these Zelda clones in the indie sphere do is they use 16-bit graphics, usually maybe even 8-bit, and they add very cool effects to them. So fire really looks like fire, snow really looks like snow, and it's put on as a layer over this 2D design. And that actually makes the game look really, really good. It's an extremely wonderful design and art style. Most of the innovations that would take place would be within the sphere of graphics and just art. But if in terms of game mechanics, I think what we would see Nintendo do is, if we want to make this 2D game for the Switch, what it might involve is some sort of innovative use of the dock versus handheld mode. And we've seen that before with Zelda games, where you can, like, for instance, with Wind Waker, you could plug a Game Boy Advance into the GameCube, and you could go and visit Tingle's Island, and Tingle would be helping you along the way by showing you secret hidden things on the map using this Game Boy Advance. I think we could do something with handheld mode, maybe, where perhaps there's certain dungeons where you have to use handheld mode because you have to use gyro features, kind of like what happened in some of Breath of the Wild's sanctuaries. And I think if you think of an innovative way to do that, I think that's something that we could expect Nintendo to do, because the only time they make a new single player game or a new game entry in general is when they can think of something new. They don't want to make the same thing they made before again. And that's why we don't get certain games very easily, because they really want it to be, well, here's this new unique component to this game. So I think that's what we would have to see with 2D Zelda on Switch.
Yeah, I share that as well with Michael. I think that Nintendo is gonna be a big improvement, not in graphics or style or art style, but in mechanics on the game in order to bring a new Zelda, at least on the 3DS. For the Switch, we are basically new to the market of the Switch because it's been basically 1 year and a half. We're almost nearing the 2 years now, but Zelda has improved, and we have seen it with Breath of the Wild. Are we going to get a 2D Zelda like A Link to the Past or A Link Between Worlds? I think yes. I think yes, because I think Nintendo would like to separate their 3D Zeldas with the 2D Zeldas, such like they did with Mario. That they did the linear New Super Mario Bros. Series, and then they did the sandbox ones, which they described them as being Super Mario 64, Sunshine, and now Mario Odyssey. I think we're gonna get something similar on Zelda as well. Maybe we not will not see it this or maybe next year, because we are basically very very close to Breath of the Wild's release, and such a big game. It's better not to saturate the market with many Zeldas. In the case of multiplayer Zeldas, I think that those games we may not see them very very close on dates. We may see it in like 4 or 5 years, but compared to a single player, I can see Zelda going 2D again, at least at the end of 2019 next year.
My request would be pretty simple. I just want to see them tackle an ocean setting, a coastal setting in 2D format, because we've seen so much of the art style been very land focused, very castle focused. I want to see a little bit of a Wind Waker 2D Zelda. That might be fun. And speaking of the Wind Waker, in Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and the Wind Waker, which C button would normally assign the Ocarina or Wind Waker? The user who asked us, they used them so often that I'd always have the Ocarina assigned C down throughout those entire games. I don't remember at all how I assigned these. I think it was random. Do either of you have a preference?
Yeah, I did. My C stick was assigned for my Ocarina was the left C stick. Basically, because when I first played Ocarina of Time, it was on a LAN game. And my friend, the one that lent the game to me, he used it there as well. So it became something between us to have that item assigned to it.
I was posting some examples in the chat just to remind us of the UI. I'm looking at the Wind Waker screenshot just to remind myself of the buttons, and I think what I would have had in where I would have had the wand, honestly, is the R button, and I honestly I hit it in Wind Waker most of the time because it wasn't as prominent as it was. I mean, I hit it in Wind Waker because it wasn't as prominent as the Ocarina was in Ocarina of Time. But in Ocarina of Time, you had the left down and right C button, and or C stick if you played the GameCube ports or the Wii U ports as well, or even the 3DS ports. And what I would do is I would have the Ocarina in the left C button, and my hook shot was always in my right, I think, and my arrows were always in my down. And I would switch if I had to switch any of those out. It would usually be the arrows, because usually there would just be some sort of scenario in Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask where you needed a certain other item for a particular purpose before switching back to the arrows. But yeah, my default situation was indeed left Ocarina, down arrows, right hook shot.
Moving on to our fourth and last question from the community. Do you care about the timeline at all, or just like to play the games without thinking about that? If you do care, when did you start to care? I'm going to answer this last. So, who wants to go first? Which of you is really passionate about the timeline?
I'm going first because I love the timeline. I consider it to be nice. It has very, very weird turns and from events and stuff. But I actually like the timeline because it makes sense. If you gave me a timeline for a Mario, I will basically just ignore it because Mario is about having fun. And there's also the theory that even Shigeru Miyamoto actually stated that most of Mario games are basically actors on a stage. So a timeline is pointless. But for Zelda, it's such a big deal because there are recurring enemies, recurring characters, recurring locations. So it makes sense for a timeline to exist. Do I care about the timeline? I do, to a certain extent. I care about it until it doesn't make the game boring, which at the moment it hasn't, because with the last in the last release of what was Breath of the Wild, I think we got something from Nintendo themselves saying that the timeline may be important for Breath of the Wild and maybe not at the same time. From what I get, they mean that the timeline on Ocarina of Time on Breath of the Wild right now is not messed up, but a mix of all timelines. A point in time where the three main timelines have timelines mixed. They are basically explaining that, and they have some sort of reason for it, maybe internal or just for making something new, changing things from the time. Some people call that they made a timeline out of nowhere. I think they did mostly after before Twilight. After that, I think they have stated that most of the games have the timeline defined before releasing, just to make sense. When did I start to care? I never did. I'm passionate about the timeline, but as I said, I'm really focused on it. It's not gonna change my game. It's not gonna change how I enjoy it. Some aspects, like specifically because I love Ganon and Ganondorf so much, they're basically my favorite Nintendo antagonists of all time. Basically, one of the reasons I care about the timeline is because of Ganon. If I don't know if you both are aware, from what Nintendo has said, there's only been two Ganon or Ganondorfs. The one from Ocarina of Time that goes and branches to three timelines, and the one to Four Swords Adventure, which is stated to be an entirely new character, which basically share the same name and same purpose. It's basically because of him that I really care on those things. I like to know that if that Ganondorf or Ganon set game is the same from Ocarina of Time, or is it a new character and all. That's the only point I go passionate with the timeline. Before or after that, I really it doesn't affect my game.
For me, the timeline, I've always wondered about it because even when I played Link's Awakening DX, which was my first Zelda, I was aware that there were other Zeldas. And I first assumed, well, the timeline is just real time. So if the first game released in 1985 and the second one released in 1987, and so on and so forth, each one is a different chapter of the history of the Legend of Zelda. So when I find out later, maybe a few years later, that these are not synchronized with real time at all, but that they are stories told completely out of order, I was very interested, and I didn't engage in speculation too much. In terms of discussing this on forums and passionate debates with other people in the 90s and 2000s. But when Nintendo, of course, released the official timeline, that helped answer a lot of suspicions. So basically, I wouldn't be involved in the discussions about the timeline so much, but I would believe the results of much of those discussions, kind of the collective community thought that was accepted at the end of all these passionate debates. I just kind of assumed them to be true, roughly. So, of course, Nintendo finally releases their timeline in Hyrule Historia, and it's really bizarre because it's broken into three separate simultaneous timelines. And it was interesting because a lot of people assumed a single linear column of time where each game was either before or after one of the others, but it ended up being split into three. And honestly, I found that a lot more satisfying because you were able to line up games that are very similar to each other. So, for instance, my favorite game is Link's Awakening, and also the Game Boy Color games, Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. And it turns out they're extremely related to each other. They happen all at the same time. Well, with the same link. So A Link to the Past link goes on to Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, and then goes on to sail a ship and end up on an island in Link's Awakening. Those are all the same link. And I thought that was very compelling. So I really do love the lore behind it. I speculate about how much of this Nintendo had decided at the time versus how much they kind of filled in the blanks when they were making Hyrule Historia. But it's good enough, honestly. You can't do anything but accept the official timeline from Nintendo, and I do love it to death. I think it's interesting that we also kind of got the origin story in the form of Skyward Sword and Minish Cap as well a bit later. And I think it's cool that they made Ocarina of Time so central because it's also so central to gaming in general. So they made it so important for the timeline. Young Link, adult Link, and whether the hero fails or is triumphant, that makes all the difference in these games. So yeah, I cared about the timeline. Now, in terms of the actual experience of the game itself, I do think it plays a role. So, for instance, Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, which aren't the most loved Zelda games, they are a lot more fun, I think, if you have played Wind Waker and you get all the references to it. So, the timeline can play a role, or at least just having played other Zeldas to get all those references. So it does enhance the Zelda experience for me, but the experience will still be amazing for me, even if there is no timeline whatsoever, and they're all considered to be completely separate and disconnected. So I'm happy either way, basically.
I'm so glad that you two answered the way that you did, because I'm about to rain on the party. I used to care a lot about the timeline, and then I realized it made no sense whatsoever. And that you can make up any timeline that you want, and it will all work out in the end. If you've listened to this podcast for any length of time that I've been on here, you know there are things I am apathetic about that I'm downright sardonic about. So I have adopted my own The Legend of Zelda timeline based on the Zelda cartoon and the Philips CDI mistake, which we probably shouldn't talk about, but we're going to. Because the world was created, and then Hyrule is established. We have stuff happen, stuff happens, cartoons were made, mistakes are made, and this is the era of dinner. The Wand of Gamelon, however, interrupts the era of dinner, and even though Link is so hungry he can eat an Octorok, we never find out what is actually for dinner. Link goes on to be a really, really terrible hero who is probably just downright whiny, and then he says, "Excuse me, princess." We don't know what the princess's response is, so this is where the timeline splits. If she doesn't excuse Link, he becomes a breakfast cereal for all we care. If he does excuse Link, or she excuses Link, we get the era of confusion, because we have the Link, the faces of evil. I actually don't know what happens during this game, and this is the point where Nintendo questions everything with CDI Philips. Link seals Ganon in the Book of Cordai. If you get that reference, you're going to go play Spirit Tracks. However, if you just want to play Zelda, go play A Link to the Past. If you did not get that reference, which I'm pretty sure 90% of the people actually listening to this right now just want me to shut up, go play the Minish Cap. And then come back to me, because the Minish Cap is a terrible experience. Now that I have opened the door for controversial and terrible opinions, let's start off with one of the most controversial Zelda opinions. Are the water temples bad game design, or are they designed to be intentionally harder than the rest of the game?
I'm gonna say something controversial that not many made there. I find water temples to be extremely. I do not think they are made bad on purpose. It may be bad design, but for me, for somebody that likes to go into the dungeon and have fun of it on it, I actually like those. I can actually say that my least favorite is Twilight Princess, the Lake Bay Temple, because not due to the design of the temple, which is based on a staircase that overflows the center of the temple, that you need to activate some mechanism to flood that center in order to access the boss chamber. But because one of the things that made Twilight Princess weird, or ugly back on the GameCube and Wii era is that the aesthetics didn't age well. So playing that temple now, it may not be good due to the camera, how it is handled and stuff, and it doesn't look pretty in my eyes at least. That's like my least favorite water temple or water dungeon on the Zelda series.
Yeah, I actually have never had too much of a problem with water temples. It's interesting that I think there is even what's considered to be a water temple of sorts in Link to the Past, where you're changing the water levels. That is even complained about even prior to the Ocarina of Time water temple, and I've never understood the hesitancy too much, other than when you get into the 3D space, swimming was always an awkward for the controls, and they hadn't really figured out how to do it as well. And the problem with Ocarina of Time's Water Temple, or even if you want to include Jabu Jabu in there, you can consider him as well, was just having a good memory, remembering where things were. And if you could do that, then you could enjoy this temple pretty easily. But a lot of people really didn't, and it became very popular to dislike that aspect of the game. It's interesting because to some extent you have to wonder whether people were just kind of following the crowd on that and whether that's really their own sincerely held opinion. Just like people would say Ocarina of Time is definitely the greatest game of all time, even to this day some people say that. You have to wonder if that's their own opinion or if they're just kind of echoing community sentiment. So I wonder how bad the Ocarina of Time's water temple really is, because I think it is well designed. It just presumed that you would remember where things were. That's all. And it also was made a lot easier with the 3DS re-release or remake of sorts, where they basically charted out the paths you were supposed to take with illuminating assets, textures against the walls and floors of the temple. So if people had had trouble in the past, now finally in the 3DS era, they had easy abilities to just know where to go next and where all the switches were, and so that changed the water level. So I enjoyed it myself before then. I think that helped alleviate in the 3DS era where where Nintendo may have gone wrong before. Also, I do speculate that if people had just written things down perhaps or been really good with maps, it would have been better. But at the same time, that makes me think maybe it is poor game design then, because not everyone is good with maps. And not everyone has that great of a memory to understand the complexity of the water temple. So, in a way, Nintendo accommodating people in the 3DS era was a design enhancement because it was more inclusive of different types of players.
Yeah, I feel like the water temples, you have to go game by game for them. Majora's Mask Water Temple, I still haven't beaten it. I started playing Majora's Mask this summer, and then I hit the water temple, and I just wanted to stop. The one from Ocarina of Time wasn't bad. I don't remember. Was there a water temple in Skyward Sword?
Yes, I believe for after the events from the desert area where you need to save the water dragon, but it was not as focused as Twilight Princess or even Ocarina of Time. It was water themed, but there wasn't much water environment on Skyward Sword. You can barely just float on the water. But compared to those two, or even Majora's, it was just water based, water themed, not center on it.
And this is one of the problems with The Legend of Zelda, is I've beaten, when I say I've played them, again, just I know I've mentioned this before, but a lot of these games I ended up beating with my sister. She did the playing, and then I assisted in encouraging with puzzle solving, and we solved the puzzles together. That's how I played most Zeldas, so just bear that in mind. because I suck at video games. But moving on to our next question, or our next topic, was Twilight Princess too large of a game? And was Wind Waker, by contrast, too empty?
I will say yes. Twilight Princess was very, very big compared to other Zeldas that normally encompass two sections of the game before entering the final dungeon. Twilight Princess has three sections. The one that you get the fused shadows, the one that you do random stuff on the Twilight possessed Hyrule areas, and the ones to gather the mirrors. And that's actually very big compared to games like Ocarina of Time and Link to the Past, which only encompass two sections, which was three dungeons, a midpoint where you face something like the final boss before the final fight, and then seven maidens or stones or seven sages, which was what happened in Ocarina of Time and Link Between Worlds and A Link to the Past. Twilight Princess breaks the mold by adding way more content and adding a third section, which can also be considered a fourth if you count the Twilight Realm dungeon, which is pretty big compared to other dungeons. I can say that, yeah, Twilight Princess is very large, and not in a bad way because you don't feel like there's nothing to do. There are side quests, there are pieces of heart you have to contain to gather. You have to gather poles and random items that you can use just to complete the game on 100%. Not very required or very mandatory to get, but yeah, I can say that compared to other 3D Zelda, and that's not comparing to Breath of the Wild because Breath of the Wild is a different beast to the other 3D Zelda games. But Twilight Princess, yeah, it's a very big game. It's a very, very large game in terms of content.
I've tried to, and this is Twilight Princess. I have a love-hate relationship with. It might be my favorite Zelda theme. Like the how mysterious and dark it is has so intrigued me. I've tried to start it 4 different times, and I never could start it. I've never beaten Twilight Princess.
I played the Wii U remake or remaster, but I did not play it when it came out on the GameCube or the Wii for some reason. I had taken a break from video games sometime around that era, and I just never got to it. But when it finally came out on the Wii U in the remastered form, it was a no-brainer for me to play this game finally, and I did. And it was amazing to me because after that extended period of a break with Zeldas of sorts, where during that period of time, if I played a Zelda, it was actually replaying Link's Awakening or Ocarina of Time or Link to the Past. Prior to that, I may have also played Majora's Mask for the first time, sometime in 2014 or something like that. I finally played Twilight Princess, and I loved how large it was, but admittedly, I did get burned out as well. But I want Zelda games to be very large, to have 8 or 9 dungeons, because I'm really afraid of Nintendo settling on, okay, we'll just do like 5 dungeons from now on or something like that. Almost like what they did with Wind Waker, where they ended up cutting 2 dungeons from Wind Waker and using those ideas in Twilight Princess. So in a way, we got what we lost with Wind Waker put into Twilight Princess. I remember getting burnt out, kind of losing steam and momentum to keep going forward right about when I got to Snow Peak Ruins, which is this big mansion on the top of Snow Peak. And it was fun when I finally did get the energy to go back into it, but it is somewhat long. It took on more of an RPG feel where, most Zeldas are probably something like 20 to 40 hours of gameplay. And I would say Twilight Princess is either on the very upper end of that 40 hours or even approaching 50 plus hours. Since the story was so integral, and since the order of events and temples and dungeons or whatever you want to call them in this game took place, the way that everything was ordered, it was very important to remember what events had transpired. And so that was what the challenge was. And relative to another game like Breath of the Wild, which is also gigantic, Breath of the Wild, you could do all 120 mini dungeons, I suppose we would call them, and all 4 divine beasts, and there wouldn't be so much of a story progression that you just lose all track of things. So I think that Breath of the Wild helps solve some of the burnout issue in that way, because you can even just skip all those 120 mini dungeons and just go for the 4 divine beasts, or even 0 and just run straight to the boss. So the freedom that was given in Breath of the Wild may have helped resolve the length issues of Twilight Princess. But me personally, if they did something like what happened in Twilight Princess again, that would actually be a positive for me, even if I get burnt out sometime in the middle, because I don't think that's necessarily Nintendo's fault. That's just my own focus. Yeah, overall, I would keep Twilight Princess just like it is.
One of the things that I want to add up to this conversation, because we actually talked about Twilight Princess, we didn't talk about Wind Waker. Wind Waker was an excellent game. It's an amazing game, but it has a very big issue. It is as big as an ocean, but as deep as a puddle. It is extremely big compared to what it is in Twilight Princess, where you actually need to do stuff before the dungeons. Because that's one of the things that Twilight Princess did that other games in Zelda hasn't done yet. In Twilight Princess, to access a dungeon, you have to complete a certain amount of tasks. With that, it'll increase the immersion of your on an adventure. On Wind Waker, it's going to point E to point B, point A to point B. That's good if the world was a little bit more filled with stuff. You're basically on an empty ocean, and not a very good place to put things. Sure, you can say and discuss that if it was a good design or anything, but yeah, I think it is a good design. But it was not well executed by that time, especially compared that the GameCube era was it was on during the GameCube era, where loading times and big chunks of game space were cut because of how small that is. Wind Waker is an excellent game, but yeah, I can say that what Twilight Princess did way better than Wind Waker was the between the dungeons thing. And that's something that you didn't do on Ocarina of Time, because on Ocarina of Time you finish a dungeon, you can go straight to the next one. Save for 1 or 2 that were the Spirit Temple, where you have to switch between times, and the Shadow Temple that you need to beat 4 temples, at least the Water Temple first before entering it. Other than that, there was no immersion on an adventure compared to Twilight Princess.
I completely disagree. Wind Waker, to me, was a game that personified adventure most, and I'm glad you brought that point up, because I feel like, to the question, was Wind Waker too empty? I can easily see how the perception, and I completely understand your point. I feel, though, like the sense of adventure, the grandeur-ness of Link, he wasn't, he's the hero in this game, but he's also just a little boy from, who lives with his grandmother, and you're sailing the ocean, and it gives this idea that Link is not bigger than the world. He is just a little part of this really massive world, and he was thrown into needing to save and help out everyone in this process. And it just, the way that you can just sail and adventure, and the great ocean theme, it's just it's very relaxing. Even if you don't find anything, to me, it settled the perception that this is a big adventure. This is a big world I get to explore, and there's always a new island on the horizon. There's the possibility. And I think, even if, yes, it was a bit too empty, it was that psychological possibility that there is something more, that there is another island. And then definitely once you actually went under the sea, you realized there's so much to this game. So that's where I stand with the Wind Waker.
I would say that the loss of those 2 dungeons for me was pretty disappointing. It seems there may even be more dungeons than that. I think Ice Ring Isle and Fire Mountain were meant to be full dungeons, and we lost those due to development time. Nintendo was trying to get this game out in time, I think was the reason. And so elements of those dungeons, I believe, were put into Twilight Princess. And if that's not the case, they were put into Phantom Hourglass. And there was also the Ghost Ship. I forget the exact name of it, but I think that, yeah, it was called the Ghost Ship. And that was also supposed to be a bigger area than it ended up being. Finally, in addition to that, I forget the name of this island. It's on the leftmost portion of the map, and it looks like it's been utterly destroyed. I think there was actually, that area was also supposed to be more significant than it ended up being. I think that might be Great Fish Isle, actually, is what it was called. So there are a lot of elements in the game where you're not blissfully, but you're fully aware of how Nintendo cut content, because the way they did it left a lot of evidence behind that there was supposed to be more to it. And in addition, Forsaken Fortress, I think that you weren't supposed to visit it as many times as you did, or even it was supposed to be yet more complex than it ended up being, because it ended up being this place you visited, I think, 3 times that filled out the game, but there was also a certain lack of substance to it that I wish they had filled in more, especially for this first grand Zelda adventure in the GameCube era, trying to follow on the much celebrated accomplishments of Ocarina of Time and even Majora's Mask. So I wish they had kept those dungeons in there, because it was so disappointing when you finally got to Ice Ring Isle and it was like just a few rooms versus a full dungeon. And and especially the Ghost Ship, it was seriously just a single room, and you just make it to the other side and you get your Triforce piece. Yeah, I wish it had been more substantive than it was, and they certainly intended it to be, but scheduling and being what it is, they had to cut things at some point, and so they did.
The Ghost Ship dungeon was actually implemented Phantom Hourglass, because there's a big dungeon on Phantom Hourglass. By the way, that's where the term Dead Man's Valley comes from. The bosses of that dungeon. The dungeon was well fledged on that game. And I think that's one of the things that actually was cut from Wind Waker and then carry over to Phantom Hourglass. And one of the things that I think that Nintendo wanted to do, because they cut so much content, was because of the feedback. I don't know if you guys are aware, but Wind Waker was not well received at first, because people were expecting some aesthetics looking like Ocarina of Time or even Twilight Princess, because of the tech demo they showed on 2001, I think, where Link is fighting Ganondorf on the sword. People expected that game to look like that, and they got a cartoony Zelda. People actually didn't like that. That's, I think, the reason why they cut that. A lot of content, because they were trying to bring Twilight Princess fast.
I think that's right, actually, because I do remember being on the side of defending Wind Waker, but most people kind of saying, oh, it's too kiddie, it's too cartoony. And I was always saying, well, it's an actually good game, and maybe cel-shaded art style is kind of cool, actually, so maybe you could give it a try. There were a lot of people who did reject Wind Waker, at least at the time. And when Twilight Princess finally came, I think that a lot of these people were relatively happy about it. I think the reception for Twilight Princess ended up being, well, it's still not as good as Ocarina of Time, but at least they made a realistic looking Zelda. And there was certainly a certain level of, there was this attitude that Zelda had to be realistic in art style. It couldn't really take risks like Wind Waker did. As Wind Waker aged, I would say, especially with the remaster on the Wii U, it really started to hit its stride. So at least now, I think it's been well received. The only unfortunate aspect is, of course, the Wii U, with there only being 10 or 11 million owners of it, it still didn't get all the attention it could get. So yeah, perhaps if they re-released that remaster on the Switch even, it would get some attention.
This is actually the question for the community to respond to this week is, What are your thoughts on the Wind Waker? Because I guess I didn't realize. I'm being outvoted here 2-1. So I'm curious. Do I just have a really bad opinion here, or are there more people in the camp of Wind Waker did provide a sense of adventure? So respond with that in your questions, and then to tackle our last topic, before we wrap up here. Skyward Sword. Skyward Sword was a bit of an interesting Zelda game because we only had one hub area, and in that hub area we got to explore a little bit more of customization. We got to, compared to past Zelda titles, there's some more crafting elements. They tried to stray a bit from the exact definitive Zelda formula and always send Link back to the main hub world. This was it was received controversially compared to the other Zelda games, and I do think that we could probably spend a long, long time talking about Skyward Sword. However, to wrap up in 5 minutes, what were your thoughts on Skyward Sword, Michael?
When I finally played it, it was so basically during something like 2013 to 2016, I was playing all the Zeldas I had not played yet. Despite considering myself like the biggest fan of this series, even to this day, I hadn't played Majora's Mask to completion. I hadn't played Skyward Sword. I hadn't played Twilight Princess. So when I got to Skyward Sword, I had already survived all the entire area where everyone was criticizing it for having Wii motion controls, and all the controversy had died down, and I was just playing it kind of on my own terms, and I enjoyed it, to be honest. I mean, I do get that having normal traditional controls is desirable, and I do agree with that to an extent. I'm not going to say that this game has to have motion controls, but I also am very open-minded with Nintendo. As a consumer, I let them experiment, and I am happy to try out their experiments. And I would say Skyward Sword was a successful experiment. It was an interesting take on Zelda that honestly, I don't think it will ever be replicated again. So it's just this one instance of Zelda that we get. Of course, Twilight Princess was ported to the to the Wii, and that had motion controls, but Skyward Sword was built with the Wii Motion Plus in mind, and the moves were more intricate, and I enjoyed it. I also enjoyed the Skyloft and being able to fly around the sky and then fly down to various portions of Hyrule. I wish that it was more interconnected and that there weren't it wasn't as disjunctive as it was, because most Zeldas, the map is just all interconnected, even if you can fast travel. That's my only complaint. I wish it was truly 100% interconnected.
I'm not gonna sugarcoat my experience with Skyward Sword. I didn't have fun with it. I loved the game. I loved the aesthetics. I loved the dungeon. I didn't love or like the in between the dungeon and the motion controls. My only exception would be for the areas on the desert where you have to use a certain crystal to recreate what happened in the past. I think it's an amazing approach just to see how much a map can load and how much aesthetics are hidden inside those crystals. I think it's an interesting concept. When I talk about motion controls, that is the main reason why I haven't played that game ever since I beat it. Not even in hard mode, not even when they released on it and the Wii U Virtual Console game, if you may call it like that. I think we could see a re-release on the Switch, being then the Joy-Cons can actually work with this. I always feel that motion controls are good for aiming, but not a sword. Twilight Princess took a very, very mediocre way to swing a sword, because there was no need to. You can have used a bottom. I think Skyward Sword made it way better because you can angle it and stuff. That doesn't mean that I really liked it or enjoyed my experience with it. I do not say something like, I may be saying stuff like Aaron Hansen from Game Grumps that he hates Skyward Sword, but it's something that I didn't enjoy 100% compared to the other Zelda.
I enjoy Skyward Sword's setting, even though it's a bit minimalist and there's only one area. I agree. I find the area magical is the best way to put it. The traveling Goron he's one of the coolest characters of the Gorons. All Gorons are cool though. And then Fee is great, especially at the end of the game. Fee is a great character at the end of the game. However, by my calculations, the batteries in our Wii remotes are nearly depleted. So it is time for us to wrap up on Hello Nintendo. Thank you very much for listening. Before we go, though, Michael, where can people find you on the internet?
Well, the main way to get in contact with me is on Reddit itself. So my username there is IwataFan. And also I am on Twitter as IwataFan_. So you can reach me either way. I'm always happy to talk with you, and maybe we even play some games.
Alexand, where can people find you?
I'm mostly a Discord guy. Alexand, and you can also find me on Reddit as well. My username on Reddit is PortalDark. You can find me also at Twitter at Alexand, but I'm mostly always on Discord compared to those two. I have like Discord, Reddit, Twitter in terms of priorities.
You can find me at ACL Haynes on Twitter. You can come and invite me to play a game. I'm more than happy to join in a Nintendo Switch showdown of Mario Brothers 3 or baseball. You can also yell at me about baseball. Playoffs are going on right now, and that is a whole lot of fun. Thank you very much for listening to Hello Nintendo, and next week we will be back to discuss something. Nintendo's always doing something.